And before I do get started, I'd like to thank Doris Tinsley and the Office of Multicultural Affairs at VCU for having me, for inviting me. It's fantastic to be here and talk to you all about this, which is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. So let me back up real quick. So the talk today that I have for you is unrooting the unperceived, understanding and confronting anti-Native sentiments in Latin America. And I'll say now off the start that this conversation could be completely expanded into a conversation about anti-Blackness as well. Because of time, I obviously won't have too much time to do that, but I will kind of gesture to that, but I do want to highlight that and made it known that there is also a huge part of the racial discourse in Latin America, just like the rest of the world. Anti-Blackness is a huge part of that as well. All right, so let's begin. Yektutak muchi nakanutuga Edward, one is Polanco, Nahaninesi ga Waitechan, Los Angeles, California, pero Nahaninits ga Gushkatan. My name is Edward Polanco. I was born in Los Angeles, California, but I come from Gushkatan, which is a series of Nahua communities in Salvador, what is now called El Salvador. So I always like to open up with land acknowledgements. So here I have VCU's land acknowledgement, acknowledging that the area that the campus is in is on the Powhatan Confederacy territory. But one of the things that I like to do, especially more recently as I've been pondering a lot of these things, is a land back acknowledgement. And that's making a very concerted effort to have institutions, particularly universities, really double down and address issues of sovereignty and intellectual sovereignty and land sovereignty with Native peoples. So one thing that I'd like to encourage you all at this moment is to reflect on ways that you can help Native and Indigenous scholars and faculty to excel and to reach their goals at VCU and any other university in Virginia or the country, really. And I'll be sending out some links towards the end of my talk for places where you can donate money. One of the organizations is a Native run organization in Chicago. It's called Chai Nations. They have a First Nations garden here. It's empowering the Native community here in Chicago to have access to healthy foods. And the other is Native Americans in Higher Education and Mentorship, which is an organization also Native operated and owned that empowers Native students to successfully complete their undergraduate studies. So with that, jump in here into a trigger warning. And I've pondered for weeks over how to present some of these materials. You know, the talk is about anti-nativeness and how to deal with talking about some of these things without perpetuating violence. I presume some of the people that are going to be here or that are going to listen to this recording are of Native ancestry or are Native and have heard some of these things. And I don't want to kind of re-trigger some of that violence, but at the same time, you know, presenting some of these things is important. So there are going to be some serious conversations about some messed up stuff. I've really tried to curate that to make it less harmful. But please, if at any point or at the end, you'd like to email me or get in contact with me and have a conversation about how I presented some of the material. You know, I'd love to hear, particularly if you're a Native person or Indigenous person. And also just to build forward with this, right? So, but again, you know, I apologize if I do harm anyone. That's not my intention. It's quite the opposite, right? So with that, let's move into the two songs that we heard as we were getting ready to move forward here. And that was Ume Taquigalis. That's two songs in Nahuatl. And the two songs are Eston Gato and DLC, Más Runas Que Nunca, two rappers from Ecuador that sing in Quechua and in Spanish, and then Jaga Riola featuring a Somali and DJ Walakuan of Singing Words. So these are two individuals from Southern California. Jaga Riola is Purepecha, and also Mali, I can't remember exactly what his affiliation is, but he's connected to some Native communities in Venezuela. and what we're going to talk about today. So let's think about change. Who can and cannot change um, their identities, the way they engage in culture, devotions, gastronomy, so food, stuff like that. Who has the privileges and not to do that? So we're going to define some terms that stem out of the colonial period. We're going to trace mestizaje through this kind of long process. It's a very convoluted term, amorphous in some ways, but we're going to trace it as best we can in a relatively short conversation. And we're going to unpack anti-nativeness as it exists in Latin American culture and in Latin American culture in the United States. And then we're going to finish off with some native resistance. And the important part of that we'll see hopefully is to drive it home, or the point home is that Native people still exist, right? Oftentimes a lot of conversations about Native people, particularly if they deal with the past or history, is that it's all in the past, and that's not the case. And I'll say also that this conversation is not about changing anyone's identity, making you rethink your identity per se. It's more about making you think how you engage with Native people's identities and Native peoples themselves. So I see this discussion as a regional discussion with hemispheric kind of implications, meaning that we're going to be talking about some areas in what is considered now Latin America, but I think it has implications for what is considered Turtle Island. And some people consider South America Turtle Island, some don't. I'll use it more freely in the sense of including South America. And who and what is native is in this conversation. And there's one drop rule, which we're familiar with in the US context, particularly for Black populations, but this question of hypodescent and hyperdescent. So hypodescent being if you have some trace of ancestry of one group that is considered to be a lower status, and this is kind of a social construct, right? But a lower status, you're put into that group if you have some kind of connection to it. Hyperdescent would be that you're bumped up to a higher group as it is prescribed in your society if you have some kind of descent in that. So it's kind of this one drop. So obviously, as we've seen in the context of the United States, starting roughly in the 19th century, where if you have any trace or ancestry, or Black ancestry, you're kind of put into the Black category, even if irrespective of how much other ancestry you might have. And sometimes you'll see the opposite, where if you have some kind of white or something like that, you'll get bumped into that one, right? So that's kind of what we see here to some degree. We'll talk about that a little more. The I word. Or indígena. So what should we be using? So this I word here, I put it here. I believe this is the only time it's going to actually show up visually in this presentation. I'm not going to say this word. It's a pejorative term in the Spanish language. It's very tied in colonialism, as we'll see. And I think this is one of probably the most anti-native things that's pervasive in Latin America, where people openly still use this word. And what it does is that it basically conflates different cultures into one. Different native cultures into just one kind of monolithic thing. It exists in various idioms and jokes throughout the Spanish-speaking world. So not just in Latin America, but also in Spain. We'll see that in a second as we talk about some definitions of this. And it carries colonial baggage, and it's harmful to native people. And we'll see why in a second. So what I'm saying here is basically, I won't be using this word. I'll be referring to it as the I word. And I encourage all of you that are from Latin America, Latin American descent, to reconsider how you use this word if you do use this word as well, because that is very detrimental, I believe. So some better terms: indígena, pueblos originarios. This is for Spanish context. Native, indigenous person, peoples, communities. The best would be in the endonym, so the name that the actual communities use for themselves. So we could have like the Honałatam, Dene, Nahua, or Micmac. So here we have 4 flags representing these different groups that I mentioned here, and we see the plurality of how these groups represent themselves and what it means. And you could do something simple as like going to each community and saying, hey, what does corn mean to you? And is there a story behind corn? And you're going to get 4 different answers in this context. And I would imagine that would be true for almost every single native indigenous nation tribe in Turtle Island, right? So it's important to use the terms that belong to these peoples when possible, so that we don't fall back into this colonial mechanism of flattening native peoples. So thinking about who can change, right? So Don Quixote Many people, I would imagine, have heard of this book written by Miguel de Cervantes in 1605. He spoke a certain way, dressed a certain way. And here we have these two individuals. One is in this particular photo, a Spanish man, Antonio Banderas, portraying a Mexican in a United Statesian film. And the other is a soccer player from Spain that plays in Spain. And both of these individuals do not dress, speak, eat, or probably even look like Miguel de Cervantes. But nobody really questions whether these two individuals are Spanish or if they're mixed in their cultural or genetic makeup. They're just simply Spaniards, right? And that's something that we should think about in the context of Native people. So this is the Popol Vuh, or the Popol Vuh, as it should be called, written in the 16th century, or transferred from kind of oral traditions into textual traditions in the 16th century. And then there's a version, the oldest one, at the Newberry Library in Chicago from the 18th century. And the people that helped create that document don't really, we shouldn't expect for them to eat or look or listen to music or speak exactly the way that their ancestors did, right? So modern Native people shouldn't be held to this standard of being exactly the same, frozen in time. And if they don't look the same, they don't eat the same, they don't live the same, and they're no longer indigenous or native, right? So here we have different Native artists from various parts of South America, and they don't speak, eat, look like their ancestors might have. So this is something that we should think about. And I'll tell you kind of, I'm going to work through this, but I'll tell you in the beginning kind of how I see this mestizo, mestiza term and how it works. So this is a colonial term, and I'll explain what it means a little bit more, and you'll kind of get it through the slide. It's a colonial term introduced by Spaniards to Turtle Island, so to the Caribbean, to what is now Latin America, and even parts of the United States. In the 20th century and the 21st century, mestizo hides colonial violence, physical and intellectual violence, and the erasure of Native people. So this idea that there's this blissful mixing of Native culture and European culture to create this miscegenated people, this mixed people, this mestizo, and it hides this violence of actual harming people physically, but also intellectually. And we'll talk about some of that as we move forward. There's no general mestizo story in the colonial period. If you look at records in the 16th, 17th century, pretty much throughout Latin America, there is no mestizo kind of consciousness, a group of people that say, hey, I'm mestizo and I'm proud of that. They're not united, they're not unified based on mixed ancestry per se. It's an inorganic category that gets cast upon people by the Spanish Empire, mostly in legal senses. The term implies that people with mixed ancestry, specifically with white, are better than pure Native people. And this is something that continues on to this day. Informs and perpetuates colonial notions of race and appearance. So what someone should look like in order to be a real Native person or a real European is informed by kind of this mestizo concept. It creates a class of people that becomes increasingly detribalized, meaning that they lose connections to their ancestral ways, their ancestral lands, with no communal claims to land or sovereignty. Yet these people are also not as structurally powerful as Spaniards or white people in their society. So it kind of creates this other set of people that isn't native, but they're also not quite settlers per se, and they don't have the structural power of the settlers in control. It destroys Native identity and Black identity as well, and alters perceptions of time. So it freezes Native people in the past, that Native people should look this way, they should eat this way, they should live this way, and it privileges Western presents and futures and overlooks the history of colonialism. So basically looking at, well, Europeanization and Europeans are so modern, so cutting edge, they're the future, but overlooking this history of violence and pain, again, physical and intellectual, that has been wielded on the Western Hemisphere and other parts of the world, with Black bodies and Native bodies. It privileges European change and modernization and erases the colonial past. So very linked to that last one, right? And it fixates on whiteness over indigeneity. So it fixates on how much whiteness someone might have versus how much nativeness they might have, or what their lived experience actually is. So let's talk about the I word. So Xiquilegua is basically like search, investigate in Nahuatl. So like to rummage through something to really get to the bottom of it. So we're going to do a little bit of that. Maybe not as intense as that verb, but looking at some dictionaries here, we see this is a natural de la India. Here I'll say the word because they're referring to the territory. So here they're miscalling what is known as Turtle Island or the North America and the Americas, whatever, as the Indies, right? But important here, this is applied to an indigenous person of America, it says here, or the West Indies. And today it is considered someone who is a pure descendant of this race with no mixture. So this is very important. So here it says, y al que hoy se considera como descendiente de aquel sin mezcla de otra raza. So with no mixture of race. So this dictionary gives us some idioms that are used with this word, and they're very harmful, as we'll see, hopefully, or we'll agree. So for example, caer de, this is one that slipped out of my, so I apologize, caer de I word, and this is someone that is tricked. So saying that you fell as the I word, you were tricked, or that you're being tricked. Hacer el I word. This is again an idiom. So this is to poke fun, to make jokes, to tease, to make people laugh. You're basically pretending like you're a native person or something of the sort. And one that I think you see quite a bit if you're from Latin America, you've probably heard this or you have Latin American descent. Subírsele a uno el I word. So this is like to have the native rise up or rise out of you. And it basically implies that the person is very upset, almost like irrationally upset, like for no reason, they're just really mad that day or something like that. And this is an idiom that's used pervasively throughout Latin America. And all of these things really hint at Native people being intellectually inferior to mixed people or people of European descent. And also kind of irrational compared to those people, right? So very harmful. So let me ask in the chat here, what year do you think this dictionary might be from? Just a guess. No right or wrong answer. You can go ahead and type it in the chat. What year you think this dictionary is from? 2021. All right, so we have some very recent stuff. Okay, 1923, I see it. Honestly, when I looked at this, I was like, please be from like 1650, but it's from 1992, which is actually very troublesome, I think, considering it is basically perpetuating stuff. It looks very, it doesn't look very different from something you see in the 17th or 18th century. And what I'd like to talk about briefly now is the creation of the Indian, and I am using the English cognate of it because in the United States and other English countries, this term is used by some. There is some, I think, there are some discussions about whether it should be used or not. But nonetheless, the creation of the Indian, it belongs to Christopher Columbus. So one thing that I think many people credit him for doing incorrectly, you know, he didn't do much. He died a deadbeat basically. But the one thing he did do, and I don't think it's positive, is create this idea of the Indian, and that's basically he thought he was in another part of the world and started calling the people that lived in this area since time immemorial as Indian. It's something that gets carried on until the present and still do it today, right? So something to keep in mind. So as this category starts to change in the colonial period, we see that after the new laws of 1542, these are some laws that are promulgated by the Spanish crown. This is issued by Charles King V in 1542. Basically, he's saying that Native peoples could not be enslaved anymore, using the I word, of course. Slow removal of the encomienda system. This is a system where basically that transfers to Turtle Island, say, right, that from Iberia in the context of the Reconquest. So we have to keep in mind that the Castilian crown, the Spanish Christian crown, is trying to regain control of Iberia from Muslims who had been there for about 800 years. And one of the things they would do is that if people helped conquer, they would give them territories, and all the people, all the Muslims in that area had to pay tax or tribute to the holder of this encomienda. This gets transferred to the Western Hemisphere, and the native people in certain territories then have to provide either work or a tribute to the holders of these systems. So basically, after this point, the Spaniards try to attempt to weed that out. And it's not because they're abusing native people, it's actually because the crown is a little bit weary that Spaniards might be accumulating too much wealth and power, and they want to kind of curtail that so that the crown can remain in control. Native people in the following places did not have to pay tribute anymore. So Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, or Hispaniola. So this would be basically Taino peoples largely in the Caribbean. And this is very unpopular among Spaniards, as you might imagine. And Bartolomé de las Casas, who we'll talk about in a bit, does not think it's strict or aggressive enough to really save the indigenous populations from the abuses of Spain. And I think that's actually very true. Indian as a legal category begins at this point. So this would be the I word in Spanish, right? So as a legal category, we begin to see it implemented in 1542 after this. Then we go to the Valladolid debates. So this is a debate between Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda and Bartolomé de las Casas. So Bartolomé de las Casas is a Dominican. He actually comes to the Western Hemisphere as a conquistador. He has his own encomienda, so he has native people paying him tribute. He's a slave owner. And then one day he sees the light, gets rid of all that, becomes a Dominican friar, and becomes a champion for native peoples. Many people see him as this amazing person. I think he did some great stuff, but I still think he still is a functionary of the colonial system. And I mean, I think the best thing he could have done is said, hey, let's leave and, leave native people alone, instead of actually trying to make the most beneficial and appropriate way for the colonial system to function with native people, which is how I see kind of how he functions. But this is the first known debate or public critical discussion held by Europeans about the status and condition of colonized peoples. Which is interesting if you think about it. It's a very unilateral thing, right? So two white dudes debating about the condition of native people, and to some degree Black people as well. Both sides are using very similar theories and theorists who argue very different things. Basic things that Ginés de Sepúlveda is saying is that native people are culturally inferior to Spaniards. They're unnatural crimes that deprive them of their rights of dominium. So this would be basically, they're not Christian. Some of them are, even though he kind of blankets all native people, they're eating each other. They have multiple wives, bigamy, polygamy, that kind of stuff. All of these are unnatural crimes, so we can take their land. And the bulls of donation are a valid charter for the Spanish conquest. So it's basically saying that if native people do not become Christian, then Spaniards can take their land. De las Casas' rebuttal, he says native people were capable of reason and they should be brought to Christianity with peace. So this is kind of, again, functioning within the colonial system still, that he's not saying, hey, we should leave them alone, but hey, let's make them Christian, but let's do it in a nice way. Let's still alter the way they think, the way they have devotions, the way they do all these things, but let's do it peacefully. He heavily cites St. Augustine, who's against the use of force to compel people to become Christian. And he points out that not all indigenous groups were the same. So he says, if you look at the people from Tehuantinsuyo, so the Quechua, Inca people, they're not the same as the Chichimeca up in northern Mexico. They have very different styles and all these things. So we can't treat them all the same. So he kind of does, in a way also, which is very colonial, categorize native people and the civility of native people. So this is something that really shapes the way that we see or native people have been seen in Latin America and I think in other parts of Turtle Island by settlers, and that's that they've been infantilized, right? That there are these debates and things that are happening and they're kind of just watching. They're not involved in the legal proceedings, right? They are in other ways, and we'll talk about that to some degree, but from a colonial perspective, it's just the colonial system talking to itself. So Ladino, this is basically a dictionary from 1611. It's telling us, this is another term we see quite a bit in Latin America, and this is a term that's used as it tells us here, basically, en rigor vale lo mesmo que Latino. And this is important. Remember this mesmo here. Que Latino mudada la T. So basically, it's the same as Latino without the T. So basically, goes on to explain that this is basically someone who is from areas that were conquered by the Romans and learned Latin, but couldn't speak it super well, right? So the people that could learn it and the culture were called Latinos or Ladinos, that they were trying to become like the Romans. And then this is kind of expanded on, he goes on to say here, to the Moors, who Muslim people in Iberia who are able to learn Spanish and engage in it, and are kind of savvy, acculturated to Spanish culture. So this is what's going to be used. You're going to see it used for Black people in the Americas that are acculturated. You're also going to see it for Native peoples. I word Ladino, for example, you'll see. So these are Native people that are acculturated to Spanish colonial society. They're learning Spanish, maybe they're dressing like Spaniards. They're engaging in lifestyles or economic trade like Spaniards or something of the sort. So this is a little song. This is a song that's just very pervasive. If you, in any way, shape, or form, are Latino, Latin American, Latinx, and went to a party in the 90s, you probably heard the song, maybe even the 2000s. If you were born after that, you might have still heard it. So take a quick listen. The lyrics are here on the side, the pertinent part.
¿Qué cultura va a tener un indio en Yumeca como Lorenzo Morales? ¿Qué cultura va a tener si nació en los Cardonales? ¿Qué cultura va a tener si nació en los Cardonales?
So what this song is credited as being, it's in the vallenato genre from Colombia. It's credited as being an exemplary song of this genre, a very emblematic song of Colombia. People have said, hey, we should turn this into the national anthem, like legitimately, people have argued for this. But this section that I have highlighted here, it's saying basically, the song is a narrative written in 1938 first of a battle between two artists. And it's saying, what culture is this man going to have with his adversary if he is an I word Yumeca, which comes from Chumeca, which comes from Jamaican. So presumably this individual was of Afro-Native descent, como Lorenzo Morales, so that's his name. What culture is he going to have if he was born in the Cardonales? So Cardonal, we'll see in a second. Yeah, a cardon is a type of cactus. We'll show you now, we don't have to wait. And so basically it's saying this guy is Afro-Native and he's born in the boonies, essentially in the hills. What kind of culture is this person going to have? So again, perpetuating this notion that Native people have less civility, less culture than and Afro people mixed in there, right? That compared to other Native or white people or Europeans or people of mixed ancestry with white. And this kind of resonates with something that maybe I think is a little more popular in Central America and Mexico and the United States. This idea, this is an artist made this bust calling attention to this trope, this anti-Native trope, usually used for people that are acting as if they're not as either Native or as Mexican, let's say, as they appear. So for example, if there's someone who looks Mexican, but they don't speak Spanish, you might say, no habla español y tiene hasta el nopal en la frente, right? Which means they don't speak Spanish and they have the cactus on the forehead. It's implying that they look very Native, but they're not acting like it. They're acting outside of their racial category, and it's used as a pejorative way to talk about someone who doesn't identify with some other roots or something like that. So this is just some examples, right, of these pervasive anti-Native terms and idioms that exist all over the place. And again, back to that song, Carlos Vives has a very healthy career still now. The song is still played all the time, and very few people have any issue with that line, which is, I think, very offensive. So let's move into mestizo real quick and talk about what that means. So looking at 1611, again, same dictionary by Spaniards, Seneca Arruias. he defines mestizo el que es engendrado de diversas especies de animales. El verbo mestizo es por mezclarse. So basically, he who is engendered or born out of diverse species of animals, from the verb to mix, so to mix something, right? Menchu, who is an Englishman who creates this dictionary Spanish to English, English to Spanish in 1617, writes for mestizo a mongrel. And in 1706, another Spanish guy, he's actually has Spanish and English ancestry, so I don't know how they maybe should have called him a mestizo, right? Because he has mixed heritage in that sense. So he says a mestizo is a mongrel, a man born of Indian and Spanish parents, from the Latin mestizo, to mix. So we see that mestizo is very, very closely attached to the animal world, to the non-human animal world, right? So we have dogs. These are Spanish Mastiffs. These are dogs that Spaniards brought with them to attack and conquer native peoples, and then horses. So this fixation on purity, blood purity, and mixture of these things, and that creates this new category. So in the colonial period, starting in the late 16th century, we see this term used more widely. It's used for people that have native ancestry, particularly, and Spanish ancestry. And it tends to be pejorative, as you see. This is from 1970. So the Real Academia Española, this is basically the premier Spanish, like from Iberia, organization on the Spanish language. And they say mestizar es corromper o adulterar las castas por el ayuntamiento o cúpula de individuos que no pertenecen a una misma, which means basically corrupting or adulterating castes, like races, by joining individuals that don't belong to the same race. And here, mestizo o mestiza es aplicarse a la persona nacida de padre y madre de raza diferente. So, person born of different parents from different races, especially for a person that is of a white man and an I word, a feminine I word, so a native woman, or a native man and a white woman. And here at the bottom, we see it is applied to animals or vegetables that result of mixing, of crossing. So it's, in my opinion, equating human beings to animals and plants, right? And so the opposite would then, let's say, be the normative term would be white, and which is a term you don't really start to see for Europeans until the 19th century. Before that, you're really going to see Spaniard mostly, and we'll see that in just a sec. But basically here you say in both these dictionaries from 1869 to 1992, not very different. Basically for humans, this is the color ascribed to Europeans or Caucasians. No relationship to animals, no relationship to anything like that. So from 1492 to 1821, Español or Spaniard is used for exogenous white people, largely from Spain. Criollo is our Spaniard born in Spanish America of Spanish ancestry. So this is the colonial nature of privileging Spaniards, exogenous settlers, as a normative and dominant category. So something that you kind of are moving towards. So we see these are classic Gasta paintings from the 18th century. We see this, we mostly be focusing on this particular one in the top left, and then here these three. But this is an Español. This box moved on me, but it should be an Español with an I word. So it's a Spanish man with a native woman, and you see a little mestizo boy. So there are these two individuals, and that is a little boy. And then we'll talk about some of the other ones in a second. So the Español, so number one, Spanish man. This is a native woman, an I word, that is what we're calling it here. We see at number three, which is a little mestizo, right? So these are kind of like looking at animals or something of the sort, right? And you're cross mixing and what kind of breeding we can do to get these different results. Another example here of a Spanish man and a native woman, and here we see a little mestizo, a child. And so this kind of creates this idea of what I call the colonial pizza, right? That people have half something and half something, and I don't like to use that term. I mean, if people want to identify that way, that's their prerogative, but I don't like to think of people as food or as objects, right? I think we're shaped by our ancestry in a variety of different ways, and we're not quite half something to half something else, right? And this is something that's widely discussed. So colonial mestizaje here, some of the differences between what it means to be a mestizo and a native person, or the I word as would be called in this period and the colonial period, is mestizos are members of the República Española. So it's basically the premier colonial society, the legal system. They're under the Inquisition's jurisdiction. They don't pay taxes. Easier to obtain licenses to carry weapons, cannot legally be leaders in native towns, and cannot legally live in native towns. Native people, on the other hand, are members of the República del I word. They're not under jurisdiction of the Inquisition. So let me back up. The República of natives, let's say, this would be a separate colonial legal system just for native people, and they have to go through those avenues to get justice. And they're under the jurisdiction of, not under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition after 1571. They have to pay tax or tribute for being native people, cannot carry weapons often, they have to petition for that, and often cannot live in Spanish towns. They can hold leadership positions in native governments. But you'll see constant complaints of people that are white, mixed heritage, or what have you, that are in native towns, living there, getting positions of power. So these rules don't really quite work as nicely as people would have liked. So after the 18th century, we see this turn of basically civilization and culture were the metric to judge non-European cultures in Latin America. So European culture was the gold standard and the goal. So here we see Simón Bolívar basically celebrating some victories during the independence in South America. And once these nations become independent nations, they're no longer colonial. They start to continue to perpetuate colonial notions in different ways, but European civilization and culture is kind of the norm and the aspiration. So we get this term that it kind of comes out in the 19th, 20th century in Indigenismo. And Indigenismo deals with native people and their place in Latin America. So the Indian problem, so to speak. And this is a discourse of national identity that puts native people at the center. And it's run and operated largely or exclusively by non-native people. And it's a counter discourse to the general narrative that attacked and belittled native people. So I think, and a lot of scholars think, Indigenismo is racist, but it's a response to larger issues of racism, some other people will say. So yes, it's racist, but it's less racist than other racist stuff. How racist or good that makes it, I don't know, but it is very problematic in my opinion, nonetheless. Another notion that exists is blancamiento, whitening. This is another thing that we see pervasively in Latin America, and many people present today will probably resonate, this will resonate with them. So mejorar la raza, that's something we see here. So here we see on the right-hand side a Brazilian artist, Modesto Brocos, 1895 pictures. This is kind of like a modern Kafka painting. So you have a Black woman who's a grandma. You have a woman who has mixed ancestry, presumably white, and this is her mother, and this is her husband, and he's white. And so the child now has created a much lighter version. So you can see the kind of juxtaposition here of this woman who's Black, and then this her granddaughter who is no longer probably going to be identified as Black and could present, or does present and could identify as something else if she chooses to do so. And this is seen as improvement of the race. This is what mejorar la raza means, is to better the race. And this is this notion that you should seek partners, romantic, sexual, whatever, that are lighter than you so that you can create a lighter offspring and better the race, right? So going back to that painting we saw earlier, you see these three things, and if you see them together, you can kind of see it as this trajectory of how you get back to Spanish, right? So you have Spanish man and native woman, a mestizo man and a Spanish woman, a castizo, and then a castizo man and a Spanish woman, Spanish all over again, right? So you have this kind of full circle of how you get back to Spanish and how you improve the race. And this kind of gets to colorism, and it gets to these notions of getting away from phenotypic Black and native aspects of people. So in Mexico, this notion of kind of indigenismo and mestizaje linked together, and you have this idea starting kind of in the late 19th century, moving into the 20th century, of indigenizing the modern and modernizing the native. So uniting all Mexican peoples into this one community as a mestizo. and creating this fifth race, as many scholars will say. Mestizaje is the main point of indigenismo well into the 1950s. And here we see this painting by a famous artist in Latin America. And we see this just a juxtaposition of kind of exactly this indigenizing and modernizing, right? So we have this kind of native past that was great, but the future, even if they might look native, is Western, and it's not native, right? Manuel Gamio publishes in 1916 this book that combats common European notions that racial mixing was bad. So a lot of times, again, these ideas of mestizaje and these ideas of indigenismo are combating racism in some capacity, but they still perpetuate racism as well. Gamio calls for eugenic measures to improve Native people. He says that a mestizo nation is kind of a statue, and basically the pedestal is Native, and the body is formed out of all the races above that. This is a very famous book, 1925, La Raza Cósmica, by Jose Vasconcelos, basically saying that the mestizo is mixing these four races to make one. So you have Native people, Europeans, Black people, and Asians all mixing to create this fifth race. But again, this kind of invisibilizes all those other peoples, and at the same time still sees as the goal becoming as European, modern, and white as possible. And this is built into a variety of different places in Mexico. So you have UNAM, which is the premier university in Mexico, and one of the premier universities in Latin America. You have Por mi raza habla de espíritu. This is their motto. And this is it playing out in before us, I believe. Here we have like this native past, and then here you have this kind of more European motifs showing kind of the future built on top of that. So our continent, old and new, is predestined to continue a fifth race, the cosmic race, which will be basically founded out of, or created, melted out of a diverse amount of races and built into unity. In El Salvador, we see blancamiento actually being very pervasive in the 19th century. So this is where my family's from. And here, basically, laws are forcing people to work, Native people to work in certain places, moving them away from their ancestral homelands or communal lands, forcing rural people to become urban, destruction of communal lands, intellectual encouragement to become white, not to become mestizo, but actually to become white. From 1930s on, you kind of see more of an adoption of mestizaje as it works in other places. So here, David Guzman, who's an intellectual trained in Guatemala, writes, and this is in El Salvador, he is a passive being that in the civil and social state of our society, despite being plainly rehabilitated by the laws of the Republic, it is necessary that the true liberal and humanitarian spirit of our institutions penetrates the native home from all sides, instructing him, removing apathy, and if possible, making him slowly disappear in the mass of contemporary civilization. So getting rid of Native people and making them as white as possible. So on the heels of the War of the Pacific, this is a war between Peru and Bolivia on one side and Chile. Native soldiers served in large numbers in Peru. Peru loses this battle, and so does Bolivia, and wealthy elites use natives as scapegoats in loss. So Hispanismo is born here, and Indigenismo is a response to anti-Native sentiments after this war. And this tries to integrate Native people, to modernize them, and bring down the oligarchy that's ruling Peru. But it lacks the state power that Mexican Indigenismo has. But nonetheless, here we see in all of these movements largely moving away from being Native, modernizing them, changing them, and seeing how they can help the state as human capital. Back to this slide we saw, so kind of all the things that I mentioned about mestizaje that I promised I would kind of touch on. I hope that I did. I can kind of hit on more of this in Q&A. I'm about wrapping up here. And this mestizo, this is a term that we're still seeing everywhere. Like it's all over the place. This is a company here in Chicago that imports items from Mexico. They have a base in Atlanta and Chicago, and they call themselves a mestizo, and it's used everywhere. And it kind of just implies this kind of just Mexican thing, right, or Latino thing that kind of is a melting pot of all things. We see some cultural appropriation using Native styles and art and all kinds of things without really gesturing to who's making it and conflating nativeness, that kind of stuff. It erases, right? So these individuals here, many of you have maybe heard about the Ayotzinapa 43 who were abducted and murdered. They've recovered some of their bodies. These are all men from Guerrero and Ayotzinapa. All of these men are from a school that has historically trained Native men, and most of these men, we could say, are Native. Their community recognizes them as Native, but the media doesn't, and the state doesn't. So it isn't 43 Native men were killed, it's 43 citizens were disappeared, and it's awful either way, but we don't get the story that they were Native. This is violence against Native people. And Native women as a joke, this is kind of one of the other things that's pervasive in Latin America as well. So we have, for Mexico, La I Word Maria, literally just called La I Word Maria. She just passed away a couple of years ago. She was active until 2014, still calling herself La I Word Maria. Paisana Jacinta in Peru was actually banned in 2014. The UN gets involved because she's so ridiculously racist. And Latenchis, Celiber in El Salvador. So these are all characters. These two individuals, Paisana and Latenchis, are both men pretending to be or dressing like women. And Maria Elena Velasco is a woman, but they all basically play on these tropes of depicting women as Native women in particular as poor, uneducated, weak, lacking class, lacking culture, having a native speech. So for example, in that dictionary we saw where it said mesmo, what I tell people is that when Native communities, some Native communities still use mesmo instead of mismo. Mesmo is actually really old Spanish, and that's how Spaniards spoke when they came to Turtle Island, and they're just using the same words. It's actually changed less than how Cervantes would have wrote. Cervantes would have put mesmo, but that's one of the ways that they poke fun at Native people. They're gullible, they're infantile. This is the tropes that all three of these people play. Stereotypes of Native people being used to entertain non-Native people. They're the butt of the joke. They are the joke. And I think the biggest thing we should see here is that we shouldn't blame these three artists per se, although I think Jacinta in particular is a very toxic kind of character. But I think we should think about what aspects of Latin American culture are enabling these three individuals to make films and to make shows that are broadcast on national TV. Without any issues, right? So I think it should make us wonder more about culture in general than just these three individuals. This is a group that was very famous in the 1990s, 80s, 90s. Very problematic stuff. This guy here wearing like a headband with a Native man with a war bonnet and all other kinds of weird stuff going on. The name of the band is Mestizo. So just a lot of weird stuff that's very anti-Native. And I'll say from a Native perspective, this is kind of very important too, and it kind of makes us rethink about what constitutes a Native person or not from a Native perspective. And this is going to be kind of a different answer everywhere, so I don't want to make it sound like I speak for all Native people in Latin America or something of the sort. But I did talk to some friends and some colleagues that are Native and some elders about what they think a mestizo is and a Native person is. And a large amount of them, some had differing opinions, but a large amount of them didn't think it's genetic. It's not about who your dad or your mom or your grandparents or your great grandparents were. It's about your mind. It's about whether you value the European aspects of society in Latin America and maybe your ancestry more than the Native side. Whether you're proud of your European last name and these structures like these churches, and maybe have a t-shirt where it just gloats on your last name, and the conquerors like Cortés and other people, or if you are in touch with your nativeness and you see that as a more important part of your life. So it's not about what you look like, and it's not about who your ancestry is per se, right? And I think that's very important. So I want to play a little clip real quick for you of a film. It's very short, that I think talks about some of these tropes in ways. This is a film made in Nahuatl. Almost all of it's in Nahuatl. The language of Nahuatl is in Mexico. And this particular scene is between two individuals that are from the same community. One of them still identifies as Native and is very active in a lot of stuff in their community. The other one identifies, I think, probably either Ladino or Mestizo maybe. And they have this kind of dialogue about this stuff. So we'll see.
¿Te da vergüenza?
Len,
Ahí andas vestido de payaso con los turistas para ver si te regalan una limosna.
Ni Motlaclenti ni Luzbel, ni Chichihuas, coloquio.
Indio pendejo. Se coloque es una pendejada, hombre.
¡Antonio! ¡Antonio, espérate! Que aquí se quedó un francés. Se les olvidó de encima el gringo. Yo no sé decir la lengua mexicana. Porque soy francés. No soy indio. Soy blanquito. Tengo mis ojos azules de santo.
¡Huito, mis tlacatilis, no más! ¡Ashkanimi xitehuacotonis! ¡Non coloquio, Zampizayotl! Pinches indios son como animales. ¿Qué? ¿Qué me ven?
So what's very moving about this scene is that throughout the film, the guy that pulls out the gun kind of doesn't ever identify as native, and then here he finally speaks in Nahuatl. But what the guy is teasing about it, first the guy that pulls out the gun says, "Hey, you should be ashamed of yourself, basically performing for these Europeans to get some coins." And he says, "Oh, hold on, stop the bus. We left another Frenchman here. He has blue eyes like a saint," and he just keeps teasing him that he doesn't speak Nahuatl, all this stuff. And then he finally gets upset and attacks him. But you see this kind of violence that happens in communities between people that don't identify with their native side and think it's bad, right? And at the end, the man says that native people are like animals; they're just as bad as animals, and he equates them to animals, just like we've been seeing in all these other things, right? So again, a very violent scene, and I'm sorry to show that to you, but I think it's good to, or it's helpful to see some of these. So ponder on some reactions that you can have. Like I've noticed this when I talk to people, and in Latin America, I actually have to tiptoe quite a bit in where I'm asking if someone's native or not, because people will get upset sometimes if you ask, "Hey, are you native?" They'll get mad, like, "Why do I look native?" or a bunch of different things, right? Or if you ask someone if they're European or Spanish or white, you'll get a very different response. So ponder about these things in your family, in your life, as you think about that, and kind of going into the home stretch here. I know I went over a little bit, but a lot of stuff to cover. Now we're going to talk about some resistance, some movements by Native people. So here we have Miriam Miranda, who's a Garifuna, who's an Afro Native community in various parts of Honduras, Guatemala, and Belize. She is fighting for women's rights in her community in Honduras. Nestora Salgado is the Olimpeca from Guerrero, who is fighting narco violence in her community. Rigoberta Menchú is Quiché Maya from Guatemala, also fighting for women's rights and native rights in Guatemala, and a place for what it means to be native, what it means to be Black and native, things of that nature. This is Victorino Torres Nava, who is a scholar, a poet, and a teacher of Nahuatl, who does amazing work in Mexico and Los Angeles. And there's a little poem he wrote, which I think is fantastic and really resonates to some of what I'm talking about today. So his poem says, "In elementary, they forced me to memorize the names of rivers and capitals in Europe, and they forced me to forget the names of rivers and names of my community. Something like this happens with our languages. If you do not speak a language beyond Spanish and any other of the whites, it is not because you have entered in the category of mestizo. It is because your grandparents were forced to forget their language and their history, and they named them mestizo." So this is what I'm kind of saying, right? That the term mestizo hides the fact that people were beat into the term mestizo, many people, right? And some people opted maybe to go into the term mestizo for preservation. Jaguar, who is Purepecha, is one of the rappers that I showed you in the beginning. Going into this, he says in one of his songs, I'm indigenous only, not mestizo. That's a European trophy. The churches on my block ain't holy, a reminder that they used to own me. So a lot of his work is reshaping what it means to be a native of Latin American descent there and in the United States, and kind of this intersection of identities, and combating this notion of mestizaje and mestizo. Natalio Hernandez, Nahua man from Lomas Doradas in Veracruz. He kind of co-ops the I word, so I will be reading it here because he's using it himself. Yo soy indio porque me nombraron así los hombres blancos cuando llegaron a esta tierra nueva. So I am an Indian, I am a native because that's what the white man named me when he came to this land. I am an Indian and I know I truly am Mexican because I speak the Mexican language, and the language of my grandparents. I am an Indian, and now my heart is very happy because a new day is coming, a new sunrise. And Immortal Cultura, Inmortal Cultura, this is one of the other groups that I showed you in the beginning, and they say, antes de ser gringo, oiga caballero, descubra sus raíces, eso es lo primero. ¿De dónde vienes? ¿De dónde venimos? Aparentar ser otro no tiene sentido. So before becoming a foreigner, a white person, listen, gentlemen, discover your roots. That's what's first. Where you come from, where we came from. Pretending to be someone else doesn't make any sense. And I will be almost wrapping up here. The Native women in Peru, that there was this large movement of Native women protesting against Jacinta, to the woman I showed you earlier, the caricature of Native women that I showed you, to get her removed from the TV. And lastly here, I think we can see Venezuela as a country that has moved in a great way. So since 2002, October 12th is known as Day of Native Resistance or Indigenous Resistance. The state, the federal government recognizes and protects knowledge from Native people. Traditional medicines, complementary therapies, Native intellectual property and knowledge are protected. Patents for genetic resources and ancestral knowledge is prohibited. There's Indigenous representation in the National Assembly. So 3 seats are guaranteed to Native people, and 1 state governorship is always reserved for a Native person as well. So there's maybe not enough, but there's a good amount of Native representation that is guaranteed in the federal structure. So with that, we'll move over into questions. And I know I ran over a bit, but I hope that's okay. I can stay a little over myself anyway. So please feel free to send me questions in the chat or raise your hand. I don't know, Dr. Miriam, if you want to field questions.
Sure thing.
See any questions here? I don't see any, so.
I don't see any in the chat either, but certainly can leave some time for even comments, questions. Please feel free.
Rocio, go ahead. Do you want to mic in or type, whatever?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this talk. And I think it serves as a very good reminder that there's still a lot of work to do. And my question is that we are living in a time, I think, when language has not caught up to how individuals identify. We even see a current trend where BIPOC is no longer seen as an inclusive term. And certainly with mestizo, as you noted, it has not only historical roots, but it also has a very complicated political and social and cultural history that is currently changing as well. So my question to you is that how is language in our current moment trying to shake free from history? And do you have any thoughts on that, of where we're going in our current moment? I know that's a super complicated answer.
Yeah. No, I think you make a lot of great points. And I do think language, I would say that language is a reflection of how behind the rest of our culture is, because I think popularly speaking, it's behind. It's not behind because we haven't updated dictionaries and books. It's because people haven't updated the way they're using the lexicon, right? And I think there's a lot of Native people. Some Native people are attempting to co-opt, the I word in Latin America. Other people are opting to make strong presses to actually stop and make people aware that it's not working, right? And there's a lot of other aspects that need to catch up. And I think one good way to do that is to bridge a lot of the discussions happening with Native people, First Nations people, and Native Americans in the United States with Latin America, because I think also like with the Two-Spirit community, for example, I think that's really far behind in a lot of the discussions that are going on in Latin America. A lot of Two-Spirit or non-binary people or queer people in Native communities are ostracized in ways that it's maybe not quite the same in the United States, right? So I think that's something that also can be bridged together, and to inform these discussions, in both ways, right? So yeah, I think I would say, I guess it's up to all of us, particularly as scholars, right, too, as well, students and scholars, to start to use this. That's why in my work, increasingly now that I've been pondering this, I've been thinking about using, like, bleeping out the I word in my work, even if in sources it appears. And that's to gesture to this and make it very clear that this is a very harmful word, and that we all need to be aware of that. Some people are aware of that, but then they revert back to using it. Right. And I'm not going to say it's like the N word in English in the Black context, right? But nonetheless, it is a very harmful word. I think that a lot of people, that has been used to abuse and ostracize people for centuries at this point. So I don't know if that kind of gets to your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. I completely agree. I think that I think we are at a pivotal moment with language, and the more voices that are included in that discussion, I think the better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think, to me, it also speaks to this whole conversation also with the X, right, the Latinx, and that where a lot of people, some people are very resistant to that, other people really want it to be more gender inclusive, but also to gesture at inclusivity for the LGBTQ plus community, right? So I think those are all very important, and seeing our place, you know, for myself, I didn't grow up identifying as Latinx in the sense that, you know, that didn't exist, but I definitely use the term, even though sometimes it's a little strange to me, because I do want to stand in solidarity with people in the LGBTQ plus community, right? And that's very important to me. So even if I have to feel a little weird sometimes saying, yeah, I'm Latinx, I'm okay with that, because I want to show solidarity to my students and to other people, you know, in the community that identify with that. So I think that's also a big part of that discussion. The last thing I'll kind of throw out to with language is and it's embedded with race, is that I also like to use like Latinos of color. So like I identify as a Latino of color, because, you know, by the general sense of the term, that someone that says they're Latino because they're from Latin America or Latin American descent, you could have a white Argentine person, and yes, they would be Latino, but I think it's a very different experience than a Latino of color, right? A person who is of Black ancestry, or is Black and Native ancestry. They're very different experiences, and I think it's important that we kind of acknowledge those very explicitly.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think, Hector, you have a question, right?
I do. First of all, Dr. Polanco, it's so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for this talk. It's really interesting. I learned a lot, or I learned something new about the colonial legal origins of some of like the racial categories that are still in use in contemporary Latin America. So my question is that at different points of your presentation, you talked about how Indigenous peoples, like in the colonial period, were labeled as irrational, and in the contemporary period, particularly within popular cultural expressions, they're labeled as a joke. So I guess my question is, could you maybe comment on what's at stake in labeling Indigenous peoples in this way, and labeling them as irrational during the colonial period, or maybe even today, as well as labeling them as a joke today? And in particular, I'm wondering what you think is at stake with regard to access to legal rights to land, so communal lands, as well as rights to national citizenship.
I mean, that's a really good question. And I think that is all, the two questions are actually strongly linked. So what's at stake is the land access and sovereignty and that kind of stuff, right? So I think in the colonial period in particular, when Native people are made animal-like and childlike perpetually, basically, what that means is that then they're basically custodians of the state, of the crown, right? So that's why you have this whole separate legal system built for Native people. Some people see it as like, oh, well, the Spaniards were trying to protect Native people. You know, did the English do that? Did the French do that? The answer is no, really, but they weren't protecting Native people per se. What I think is they were protecting them, but still within this colonial apparatus, right? So you're basically saying, we're going to take care of your land. We're going to take care of your future, all of these types of things, because you're childlike, right? Just like let's say in a family, right, children, 4, 5, 6-year-old children aren't making choices for themselves usually. And that's essentially what happens, right? And you see this actual metaphorical argument made by some Spaniards in the 16th, 17th century that the native people are like children and that they need a father, right? So like the church being the father sometimes to protect them and to guide them to make the future. And what this means then is that you don't have sovereignty over your land, right? And one of the huge issues here too is that unlike the United States and Canada, in Latin America, by and large, the Spanish crown and then the national governments that followed in whatever country didn't make treaties with native communities. There are some exceptions to that, but by and large, that's one of the big differences. And what that does as well is that limits sovereignty claims to land. What you do have is communal land or the ejido that exists in large parts of Latin America, which is largely destroyed in the 1890s, as I'm sure you know. And that makes it very difficult then to have claims to your land, right? Because you're seen as an irrational child that doesn't know what you're doing, doesn't know your own good, your own welfare, and you don't have rights to these arguments, right? To make these arguments in courts. So I think that's kind of at stake in the colonial period. And in the modern period, I think it continues to perpetuate these ideas of invisibility, right? So like that Native people don't exist anymore, and if they do, they're kind of just in this past. They're a joke, and it's harmful in that capacity. And I guess what's at stake there is, as I stated, I guess is re-perpetuating or continuing to perpetuate the colonial schemes and violence towards Native peoples and to trivialize their experiences and to trivialize Native identities, customs, languages, right? And this is all part of the colonial system of basically making it so that you don't want to learn native languages, or if you speak a native language that you don't want to learn it because it's not important, you don't want to teach it to your children. You start to destruction and whittling of your culture, right? Because if you see on TV that, well, your culture is being attacked and it's seen as stupid, there's a couple different responses you could take, but one natural response could be, to internalize that and then seek ways to move aside from that. And that's what happens in quite a few countries when you mix that with violence as well, right? So like in El Salvador, for example, where there has been state violence, and in other countries, Guatemala too, where people start to move away from their customs. And then, the government comes in and says, well, you don't speak the language, you don't dress like your ancestors, you don't look like your ancestors, so then how are you your ancestors, right? So I think that's what's at stake. If that I think that's answers all your questions. Please follow up if I missed something.
This is great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Maria, definitely that's one of the ironic parts is that some of the people on stage with him, I think identify as Native, and there's definitely Native elements to the music for sure. So it's an Afro, Latin American. So I think it's very troublesome and perverse in the sense of, this colonial irony of this, right? Any other questions, comments?
It sounds like we're winding down.
Yeah.
Mhm. Just wanted to say thank you again.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is fantastic. Thank you again for the opportunity. Oh, and I promised you all some links, so let me send those before I get out of here.
What I can also do is compiling all the resources that you want to share, and then we can send that out to the list of folks who registered so they can have access to that as well.
Okay, yeah, I just sent them in there.
Wonderful.
Yeah, those take you right to kind of donate for these two organizations that I mentioned. And yeah, any questions? Let me put my email here too. I can also share that with Dr. Miriam here. But yeah, any questions, any follow-up stuff, I'd be more than happy to discuss.
Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Blanco. This was amazing. I know folks have shared already, but I learned so much as well, and just grateful for you for taking the time to teach us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Everybody have a great weekend, and next week during what settlers celebrate as Thanksgiving, make sure you think about how we can empower Native communities and continue to help the fight. Thank you all for coming, and thank you again, ECU. Amazing being here with you.
Take care, everyone.